On my birthday, my own son looked me in the eye and said, "You shouldn't expect anything at your age." I stayed quiet that night, but the next day he found a package from me on his doorstep, and what was inside changed his life forever. Before we start the story, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. My name is Norman, and yesterday was my birthday. I woke up early, brewed a fresh cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, waiting for a call that never came. The clock on the wall ticked louder with every passing hour, but the phone stayed quiet. I kept thinking maybe my son Charles had simply been caught up with work. Maybe he would remember later in the evening and call with an apology. But when he finally stopped by, he didn't come with a smile, a cake, or even a card. He stood in the doorway with his arms folded and said coldly, "You shouldn't expect anything at your age." The words pierced me in a way I cannot describe. For a moment, I thought I might break down right in front of him, but instead I just nodded and forced a weak smile. I told him it was fine, even though it was not. He left a few minutes later without even looking back, and the house became painfully quiet again. I sat staring at the framed picture of my late wife, Ellen, on the mantel. She had always made birthdays feel special, no matter how simple the celebration. Now all I had was silence, and the echo of my son's cruel words. But as I sat there, a plan began forming in my mind. I had stayed calm in front of him, but tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Charles would receive something from me that he would never forget. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the bitterness of Charles's words circling in my mind like a restless storm. "You shouldn't expect anything at your age." I repeated it quietly to myself, and it stung every time. I thought back to all the birthdays when he was a boy. I remembered saving every spare dollar to buy him the toy train he had begged for, staying up late to put together his bicycle so he would wake up to it with shining eyes, and baking cakes with Ellen, even when money was tight. Every year, without fail, I made sure he felt loved and celebrated. And now here I was, an old man, treated like a burden, as if my life and my years no longer mattered. The silence in the house pressed down on me, but instead of breaking me, it gave me strength. I turned on the bedside lamp, took out a notepad from the drawer, and began to write. My hands trembled slightly, but my mind was sharp. I knew exactly what I wanted Charles to receive the next day. It would not be anger, and it would not be scolding. It would be something far more powerful, something that would remind him of everything he had forgotten. By morning, I had a clear plan in my head. The kitchen smelled of strong coffee as I sat at the table with a stack of old boxes pulled down from the attic. Dust clung to my fingers as I opened each one, and memories spilled out with every faded photo, every folded letter, every small object I had kept over the years. There was the drawing Charles made in second grade of him and me fishing by the lake, both of us smiling under a crooked sun. There was the birthday card he had given me when he was 10, written in shaky handwriting saying, "Happy birthday, Dad. You are the best in the world." I ran my hand over the words, my throat tightening. How had that little boy grown into the man who stood in my doorway yesterday with such coldness? I pulled out receipts too, records of the tuition I had paid when he went to college, the hospital bills I had covered when he had no insurance, the car loan I finished paying when he couldn't keep up. Each slip of paper was a reminder of sacrifice, of love expressed not through words but through years of quiet support. I began sorting through the pile, setting aside the things that mattered most. This was not just a package I was preparing. It was a message my son needed to face, whether he was ready or not. The sun was creeping through the curtains when I finally began arranging everything. I laid the items out across the dining table, one by one, like pieces of a puzzle that told a story only I could see clearly. First, the photo album Ellen had put together during Charles's childhood. The pages were worn and the edges frayed, but every photograph held a memory too important to fade. There was one of Charles on his 5th birthday, frosting smeared on his cheeks while I held him on my lap and Ellen lit the candles. Another showed his first day of school, his tiny hand gripping mine so tightly it left a mark. Each picture whispered reminders of love, of devotion, of moments he now seemed to have buried under years of indifference. Beside the album, I placed the birthday card he had made me with crayons, where he had drawn himself and me side by side with the words, "You're my hero, Dad." I stared at that crooked drawing longer than I meant to, my chest tightening with both pride and pain. Next, I added a bundle of receipts and letters, proof of the nights I worked double shifts to cover his college books, of the loan I paid when his business nearly collapsed, of the hospital bills I shouldered when he said he had no way out. These papers were not just numbers. They were pieces of my life I had willingly given up so he could build his own. As I stacked everything together, I thought about Ellen. She had always believed kindness could change a heart, even one hardened by selfishness. I could almost hear her voice in the quiet room, telling me not to lash out in anger, but to remind Charles of the love he had forgotten. That was why I stayed calm last night, why I bit back the words that burned in my throat. Anger only push him further away. But truth, wrapped in undeniable memories, could pierce deeper than any scolding. I chose a plain brown box, nothing fancy, and began to fill it carefully, making sure every item had its place. At the top, I laid a letter I had written at dawn, my handwriting shaky but deliberate. I didn't fill it with complaints or bitterness. Instead, I wrote about the years, about the moments that mattered, about how respect was worth more than gifts. I ended it with a line that I knew would cut straight through his pride. "You told me not to expect anything at my age, but I expected at least my son to remember who made him the man he is today." When I sealed the box, my hands were steady. For the first time since hearing those cruel words, I felt a strange calmness settle over me. Tomorrow, when Charles opened this package, he would not find anger. He would find the truth he had been running from. And whether he liked it or not, it would change something inside him. Once the package was sealed, I sat back in my chair and let out a long breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The box looked so ordinary on the outside, just plain cardboard with a strip of tape across the top. But I knew what was inside carried more weight than any expensive gift. It carried years of sacrifice, love, and disappointment, all pressed together in one place. I ran my fingers across the top, as if I were closing a chapter of my life. For a moment, I wondered if Charles would even bother opening it. He was careless in so many ways these days, brushing things aside as though nothing mattered unless it served him. But then I remembered. Curiosity had always been his weakness. Even as a child, if a box appeared on the kitchen table, he could never resist tearing into it to see what was inside. He might have grown older, but that part of him never changed. I wrote his name on the front in bold letters, and below it I added, "From Dad." Those two words felt heavier than anything else I had packed. They were simple, but they carried a reminder. No matter how old he became, he was still my son, and I was still his father. I placed the box near the door, ready for the morning when I would send it. Then I sat in the living room, the quiet pressing in around me. The lamp threw a weak light across the room, highlighting the picture frames on the wall. Ellen holding a baby Charles, Charles at his graduation, the three of us together one Christmas morning. I traced the outlines with my eyes and felt the years pressing against me. How had it come to this? How had the little boy who once clung to my hand turned into a man who could stand in my doorway and say I shouldn't expect anything at my age? The night stretched on slowly. I poured myself a glass of water. Thought came, a memory of the way his expression softened whenever Ellen scolded him with kindness instead of anger. He could put up walls against shouting, but against tenderness and truth, he always broke. I hoped somewhere inside him, that same boy still lived, waiting to be reminded. Before bed, I added one last thing to the package. It was a small silver watch, the one Ellen had given me on our 20th anniversary. I had worn it for years, and the strap was worn smooth, but it still ticked faithfully. On the back was the engraving, "Time is precious, spend it with love." I tucked it carefully between the album and the letter. That watch was the heart of the message, the reminder that time was slipping past us, and that one day it would be too late to fix what was broken. When I finally turned off the light, I felt an unusual calm. Tomorrow would be the true test. I wasn't sure how Charles would react, but I knew one thing for certain: he would not be able to ignore it. The box was not just a collection of memories, it was a mirror, and when he looked inside, he would have to face himself. The next morning the sky was gray, the kind of heavy gray that made the world feel slower. I stood at the window for a long while, watching the wind push at the trees in the yard, listening to the faint sound of branches scraping against the glass. The box sat by the door, waiting, almost staring at me with the same patience I had carried for years. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in my arms. It wasn't heavy in size, but it carried the weight of decades, the weight of a father's devotion and disappointments wrapped in cardboard and tape. I placed it in the back seat of my car and drove into town. The streets were quiet that early, a few shops opening their shutters, a newspaper boy tossing folded pages onto porches. I pulled up in front of the post office, sat for a moment gripping the steering wheel, and wondered if I should turn back. Part of me feared that sending the package would open wounds too deep to close. What if Charles grew angrier? What if he ignored it, tossed it aside like junk mail? I almost convinced myself to drive back home, put the box away, and forget the whole thing. But then I remembered the way he looked at me last night, the emptiness in his eyes as he spoke those cruel words. If I stayed silent now, that emptiness would only grow, and one day there might be no chance left to reach him. With that thought, I carried the box inside. The woman at the counter greeted me kindly. She looked at the name written on the box and then back at me, but she didn't ask questions. She simply weighed it, stamped it, and slid it into the pile of outgoing parcels. As I watched it disappear behind the counter, my heart tightened. That box was now out of my hands. Whatever it would do, whatever it would stir in my son, I had no control anymore. On the drive back, my mind drifted to the years I had carried him, through storms he never even knew about. When Ellen fell ill and I had to juggle hospital visits with keeping a roof over our heads, I never told him how close we came to losing everything. When he was 16 and wrecked his first car, I worked nights to cover the repair because I didn't want him to feel the weight of my struggles. And when his marriage failed, I opened my home to him for months, cooked his meals, and reminded him every day that he wasn't alone. He had forgotten all of that, or perhaps he had chosen not to remember. When I got home, the house felt emptier than usual. I walked into the kitchen and stared at the chair across from mine, the one where Ellen used to sit. "I hope this works," I whispered, as if she were still there, listening. I poured myself coffee and sat in silence, imagining the moment Charles would tear open the tape, lift the flaps, and see his childhood staring back at him. The photo album, the little card he once drew with crayons, the bills I had paid to keep him safe, and the watch engraved with her words. He could laugh at me, he could call me sentimental, but he could not escape the truth staring back at him. That day passed slowly. Every tick of the clock on the wall sounded louder than usual. I kept glancing at the phone, half expecting a call. I told myself not to hope, not to expect too much. Still, somewhere deep inside me, I wished the box would not just reach his hands, it would reach his heart. By late afternoon, the silence in the house had grown unbearable. I moved from room to room, straightening things that didn't need straightening, folding laundry that was already folded, and polishing the same spot on the kitchen counter until the cloth was damp in my hand. I was restless, waiting, though I tried to pretend I wasn't. My thoughts kept circling back to Charles. I wondered what he was doing at that very moment. Was the package sitting unopened on his table, the tape still uncut, or had curiosity gotten the better of him already? I pictured him carrying it in from the porch, reading my handwriting on the label, his brow furrowed in confusion. He would not have expected anything from me after the way he spoke last night. That thought alone gave me a bitter kind of satisfaction. As the hours passed, I replayed his words again and again. You shouldn't expect anything at your age. Each time I remembered, it struck me differently. At first it was pure hurt, the sting of rejection from the very child I had raised. Then it became anger, a sharp edge in my chest. And later, as I thought more, it became sorrow. Because those words weren't just about a forgotten birthday. They revealed what he truly thought of me, of age, of family, of duty. It was easier for him to dismiss me than to face the truth of what he owed. I tried to push the anger down, telling myself that the package would speak louder than any room. The air felt heavy with the scent of old wood and faint traces of Ellen's rose perfume, though I knew that was just my memory playing tricks. I sat in her chair by the window, hands folded, eyes fixed on the street outside. Every car that passed made my heart jolt, but none of them stopped in front of my house. I checked the phone too often, lifting it just to hear the dial tone, as though confirming it still worked. No calls came. The silence grew thicker, pressing down on me. My mind wandered to Charles as a boy. I remembered how he used to run into the kitchen on my birthdays, dragging Ellen by the hand, carrying some clumsy gift he had made at school. One year, he built a lopsided wooden box in shop class. He had painted it blue, though the paint dripped down the sides unevenly. "It's for your tools, Dad," he had said proudly, even though it could barely hold a hammer. I had kept it anyway, not for the usefulness, but for the love behind it. That was what made the memory of last night so cruel. How had the boy who once thought I was worth building for turned into a man who thought I was worth nothing at all? The clock struck 8. I poured myself tea and carried it back to the window. My hands shook a little, not from the weight of the cup but from the anticipation twisting inside me. I told myself that maybe Charles needed time. Perhaps he had opened the package, but the words, the photos, the watch, they needed to sink in before he could face me. Maybe he was sitting at his own table right now, staring at those memories with tears in his eyes, wrestling with feelings he had buried for too long. I tried to hold on to that thought, though doubt crept in. He had changed so much. What if the package only made him colder? What if he laughed at it, tossed it all in the trash, and decided I was foolish for sending it? I pressed my hand against the cool glass of the window and whispered softly, "Don't throw it away, son. Just look. Just remember." The night grew darker, and though no call came, I held on to one fragile hope, that when it did, his voice would not sound the same as it did yesterday. The following morning I woke earlier than usual, long before the first rays of sun crept through the curtains. The house was still and quiet, the kind of quiet that almost rang in your ears. I sat on the edge of the bed with my slippers half on, my mind restless. My first thought was the package. Had Charles opened it yet? Had he held the photo album in his hands, read my letter, seen the watch? Or had it sat untouched on his kitchen counter, waiting for some other day when he felt less occupied with his own life? I tried not to let the uncertainty consume me, but it was nearly impossible. I brewed coffee just to keep my hands busy, though even the rich smell did nothing to ease the knot inside my chest. As I sipped slowly, I thought back to one of my own birthdays many years ago, when Ellen was still alive. She had gathered friends and neighbors for a surprise party. Charles had been only 12 then, his eyes wide with excitement as he shouted, "Happy birthday, Dad," and shoved a badly wrapped package into my lap. Inside was a small wooden carving he had made at school, a little figure of a man holding a hammer. I had kept it on my desk for decades, even after the edges chipped and the wood grew dull. That memory burned bright in my mind, and I could not help but ask myself, where had that boy gone? When had his eagerness to celebrate his father's life turned into indifference? By mid-morning, I found myself pacing the length of the living room. My eyes drifted constantly to the phone on the table. Each time it remained silent, I felt my chest tighten a little more. I reminded myself that people often take time to process difficult truths. The package I had sent wasn't just a gift, it was a mirror. And not everyone likes what they see when they're forced to look back at the reflection of their past. If Charles had opened it, he would be facing not only the sacrifices I had made, but also his own neglect. That sort of realization could not be easy. Around noon, the silence began to feel unbearable again, so I stepped outside and took a slow walk around the yard. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth from the night's rain. Ellen's rose bushes lined the side of the house, though now they were half wild, branches reaching every which way. I crouched to pluck a withered petal from one of them and thought of her voice, always so gentle, always reminding me that kindness could do more than anger ever could. "Don't scold him," she would have said. "Remind him of love, Norman. Remind him who he is." I whispered back into the empty air. "That's what I tried to do, Ellen. I hope it's enough." As the afternoon rolled on, my nerves wore thin. I sat back at the kitchen table, staring at the framed drawing of Charles's childhood fishing trip, the one still pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet. His crooked stick figures and the words, "Best day ever with Dad," glared back at me. If that memory mattered to him once, surely it still lived somewhere inside him. Surely he could not have buried it completely. Then, just as the clock ticked past 3, the phone rang. The sudden sound startled me so much that I nearly knocked over my cup. My hand shook as I reached for the receiver. For a second, I hesitated, afraid of what I might hear on the other end. Would it be Charles with his voice sharp and dismissive calling my package an insult? Or would it be silence broken by a tone I had not heard in years, a son's voice softened by guilt, by recognition, maybe even by love? With my heart pounding in my chest, I lifted the receiver slowly to my ear and said, "Hello." For a moment there was nothing but silence on the other end, a silence so heavy it pressed against my ear. Then I heard it, a shaky breath, uneven, as though the person holding the line had been fighting with his own words before letting any of them out. "Dad." It was Charles' voice, but not the one from 2 nights ago, sharp and dismissive. This one sounded smaller, almost like the voice of the boy who once held my hand too tightly on his first day of school. "Dad, I got the box." I leaned back in my chair, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. My chest ached with both relief and tension. I wanted to respond quickly, but I forced myself to wait, to give him the space to continue. The quiet stretched, filled only by the sound of his breathing. Finally, he spoke again, his words tumbling out unevenly. "I didn't know you kept all those things, the drawings, the cards, the bills you paid. I didn't realize, I didn't see it." His voice cracked on the last words, like the weight of the truth had finally broken through the wall he had built around himself. I closed my eyes and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I kept them because they mattered," I said softly. "Every piece of it was part of our life, part of raising you." My words hung in the air. There was another pause, and then I heard a sound I hadn't expected, Charles trying to stifle a sob. "The watch," he whispered, almost too quietly for me to catch. "You sent me Mom's watch. Why would you give me that?" I looked toward the mantel where Ellen's photograph rested. Her smile in that picture seemed to answer for me, but I spoke anyway. "Because time is precious, Charles, and because I wanted you to remember what she always told us. Spend it with love. You don't get it back once it's gone." There was a muffled sound on the line, as if he had pressed his hand over his mouth. I imagined him sitting in his kitchen, the box torn open on the table, the photo album spread in front of him, the watch glinting in the light. Perhaps for the first time in years, he was seeing his own life, not through his pride, but through mine. "I was wrong," he finally said, his words coming out broken. About your birthday, about everything. I don't know why I said what I did. I thought getting older meant you didn't care about those things anymore. I thought you didn't need it." My throat tightened. "Charles," I said slowly, "everyone needs to feel remembered, no matter the age. Respect doesn't stop when birthdays stop." There was silence again, but not the heavy silence from before. This one felt like the space before rain, something ready to break, something cleansing. His voice returned, steadier but softer, carrying a weight I hadn't heard from him in years. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try." I sat there, holding the receiver, staring at Ellen's picture, my hand trembling slightly. The package had done what were years. My son wasn't speaking like a stranger. He was speaking like the boy I once knew, the boy who used to draw crooked houses with me in them and write "Best Dad" in purple crayon. "You can make it right," I told him gently, "by remembering. Not just me, but what family really means. Start there, Charles, that's enough." On the other end, I heard him whisper, "I'll remember, Dad, I promise." And for the first time since Ellen passed, I believed him. After I hung up the phone, I sat in silence, my hand still resting on the receiver, as if part of me feared that if I moved, the moment would vanish. The house around me felt different, lighter somehow, as though the walls themselves had been holding their breath alongside me and were finally allowed to exhale. I stood slowly and walked to the window. The late afternoon light had turned golden, spilling across the yard and catching on Ellen's rose bushes. The blooms looked brighter than they had yesterday, and for a fleeting second, I almost felt as though she were there, telling me that what I had done was right. But even in that brief relief, my mind remained cautious. Words are easy, I thought to myself. Promises spill from the lips when guilt is fresh. What mattered was not what Charles had said, but what he would do. I had spent too many years quietly picking up the pieces for him, too many years believing that the next time would be different. My heart wanted to trust his words, but my years of disappointment warned me to guard myself. Still, something about the tremor in his voice, the way it cracked when he spoke of the watch, gave me hope. For the first time in a long while, he had sounded human, not hardened. I walked back to the table and pulled open the drawer where I had tucked away the rough drafts of the letter I had sent him. Scraps of paper covered in scratched-out words spilled across the wood. I had wrestled with every sentence, trying to balance between kindness and honesty, between memory and warning. Reading over them now, I realized I had written those drafts as much for myself as for him. They reminded me of what I still expected, not gifts, not grand gestures, but respect, the simple recognition that my years still carried weight. As night settled in, I thought about the future. Would Charles come by tomorrow? Would he try to sit at this very table with me and speak not as a tired son, but as a man willing to mend what had been broken? I hoped so. Yet I also knew that real change was slow. Guilt could spark a flame, but effort kept it burning. I made myself a simple dinner and ate in quiet thought, the fork scraping softly against the plate. Between each bite, I found my eyes drifting back to Ellen's photograph on the mantel. "You see," I murmured softly to her, though my voice trembled, "he heard you, not me. He heard your words in that watch. You've always known how to reach him better than I did." My voice faltered then, but I smiled through it. For years I had feared that I was alone in teaching Charles the meaning of love. But perhaps I had never really been alone at all. Before bed, I walked out into the yard where the night air was cool and still. The stars were faint behind drifting clouds, and the air carried the faintest scent of roses. I stood there for a long time, staring up, thinking of the boy who once clutched my hand, and the man who now had to decide whether he would honor the father who had carried him through so much. For the first time in years, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, he would choose differently now. As I turned to go back inside, I whispered into the night, "The package was only the beginning. Tomorrow will tell me if he truly understands." And with that thought, I closed the door gently behind me, the house no longer as heavy as it once had been. The following morning arrived with a pale sky, streaked with the faint blush of dawn. I rose earlier than usual, though I had barely slept at all. My mind was restless, turning over every word from the phone call the day before. Charles's voice still echoed in my ears, shaken, unsure, and apologetic. It had been years since I had heard him speak like that, stripped of pride and defenses. But I knew too well that apologies were fragile things. They could either grow into real change or wither into nothing as soon as the guilt faded. I moved quietly through the house, making coffee, buttering a slice of toast, and sitting at the kitchen table where the morning light spilled across the wood. The newspaper lay folded beside me, but I barely glanced at it. My thoughts were elsewhere, wandering between past and present, between hope and doubt. I wanted to believe my son's words, but memories of broken promises pressed heavily on me. Too many times before I had seen remorse flicker in him, only to vanish when responsibility came knocking. As I stirred the coffee slowly, I thought back to the years after Ellen passed. That was when Charles had begun leaning on me most heavily. First for money, then for guidance, then for favors that seemed endless. At first, I gave freely. I told myself it was natural, that he was grieving too, that he needed help to stand on his own. But as the months turned into years, I began to see how much he had grown used to depending on me. Each time I gave, it became easier for him to ask again. Each time I stayed silent, it became easier for him to forget gratitude. And now, here I was, waiting once more, wondering if this time would be different. The hours stretched on. Around mid-morning, I found myself standing at the window, watching the street outside. I told myself not to expect him, not to let disappointment take root if he failed to appear. But when a familiar car finally pulled into the driveway, my heart gave a sharp jolt. Charles stepped out, his shoulders slightly hunched, his hands buried in his pockets. There was no swagger in his walk. This time, none of the careless confidence he often carried. He looked uncertain, almost nervous, like a boy arriving late to class. I opened the door before he could knock. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. His eyes were red, as though he hadn't slept either, and in his hands he held the box I had sent. The tape had been cut, the flaps bent, the contents neatly repacked inside. He held it out toward me awkwardly, as if it weighed more than his arms could carry. "Dad," he said quietly, I didn't know how else to come here." I stepped aside and let him in. He set the box on the kitchen table, the same table where I had prepared it just days before. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, filled with all the unspoken years between us. Finally, he pulled out one of the items, the photo album. He opened it carefully, his fingers tracing over the worn edges of the pages. His eyes lingered on the picture of him as a child, his cheeks smeared with frosting, Ellen's hands steadying the cake in front of him while I held him close. He swallowed hard. "I don't remember this day," he said softly, "but you did. You remembered everything." I sat across from him, watching as his hands shook slightly. "That's what being a parent is," I said. "You remember even when they don't. You hold on to the things they forget." He closed the album and reached for the watch. He turned it over in his palm, the engraved words glinting faintly in the light. His thumb brushed over the inscription, and I saw his jaw tighten. "Time is precious," he whispered, repeating Ellen's words aloud. "I didn't realize how much time I've wasted." His voice cracked again, and for the first time in years I saw tears in his eyes. We sat in that kitchen for nearly an hour, the box between us, speaking little but feeling much. He confessed things I hadn't expected, that he had always felt overshadowed by my strength, that he had resented my quiet sacrifices because they reminded him of his own failures. I listened, my heart heavy but open. I told him that I never wanted him to compete with me, only to remember that respect was the only gift a father ever truly needed from his son. By the time he left, the box was still on the table, but something in the air between us had shifted. He promised to return soon, not with excuses or apologies this time, but with presence. Whether he would keep that promise, only time would tell, but as I stood in the doorway watching him drive away, I felt something I had not felt in years: hope. Hope that the boy who once clutched my hand was still somewhere inside the man, waiting to come back to me. And in that moment I whispered to myself, maybe the package really did change his life. Maybe, just maybe, it saved what was left of ours. That night after Charles had left, the house felt strangely alive. It wasn't filled with voices or laughter the way it had been years ago, when Ellen was here and Charles was still a boy. But there was something different in the air. I moved slowly through each room, my mind replaying the morning's visit over and over again. I could still see the way he sat at the kitchen table, shoulders bent, eyes lowered, the photo album trembling slightly in his hands. That image stayed with me. It was not the posture of a man proud of himself, but of one weighed down by shame. For years I had wanted him to feel that shame, not because I wished him pain, but because without it he would never see clearly what he had thrown away. I sat down in Ellen's old chair by the window and looked at her picture on the mantel. "He came back," I said quietly, as though she could hear me. "You'd have been proud of him today." For once he listened. The sound of my own voice in the empty room startled me, but it also steadied me. I often spoke to her in whispers, little murmurs of the day or stray thoughts that pressed too heavy to keep inside. Tonight, though, I spoke more boldly. "I think he's changing," I said. "Maybe not all at once, but something in him broke open when he held that watch. It was you, Ellen. It was always you who could reach him better than I ever could." My thoughts drifted back to the conversation we had shared that morning. His words were clumsy, halting, but honest in a way I had not heard from him in years. He told me that when he opened the box, he almost closed it again without looking. He said he had been afraid of what he might find, afraid that it would be another reminder of how far he had drifted. But curiosity won, and when he pulled out the photo album, he couldn't put it down. He said he turned each page slowly, his stomach tightening with every memory. He said the worst part wasn't realizing what I had done for him. It was realizing how much he had forgotten, how easily he had brushed aside the things that had once mattered most. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the shadows gathering on the ceiling. I thought about how close I had come to never sending that package. If I had let pride or anger win, I might have stayed silent, and Charles might never have faced the truth. He might have gone on thinking birthdays didn't matter, that fathers didn't need respect, that age meant invisibility. Instead, he had been forced to sit in front of the very evidence of his childhood, forced to look at himself through the eyes of the man who had raised him, and for once, he hadn't turned away. The evening grew darker, and I lit the small lamp on the table. The glow fell over the box, which still sat where Charles had left it, its flaps slightly bent. I hadn't touched it since he walked out the door. It felt strange, almost sacred now, as though it had done its job and belonged to him, not me. I thought about whether I should keep it here or send it back with him next time. After all, the contents inside weren't meant for me. They were reminders for him. Maybe he needed them more than I did. I rose from the chair and walked into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. As I stood at the sink, I found myself wondering what tomorrow would bring. Would Charles call again? Would he come by? Perhaps with something as simple as a smile, or maybe even a card, late though it would be. I didn't dare let myself expect too much, but hope had already crept in. It sat quietly in the corner of my heart, cautious but alive. Before heading to bed, I paused once more at the mantel, my eyes lingering on Ellen's photograph. "We'll see, my love," I whispered. "We'll see if he keeps his word this time. But I think something in him has finally woken up." I turned off the lamp, and the room sank into shadow. For the first time in many years, I climbed into bed, not with bitterness in my chest, but with a fragile sense of peace. And as I closed my eyes, one thought carried me into sleep. Sometimes it takes only one box, one reminder, to bring back everything that should never have been forgotten. The following day moved at a slow, steady rhythm, though my heart was anything but calm. I woke before the sun once again, the house still blanketed in darkness. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I made my way to the kitchen, where the kettle hissed and steam rose into the chill of the morning. I carried my cup to the table and sat in the same spot I had sat for years, staring at the chair across from me, the chair where Ellen had once sat, the chair I now wished my son would sit in more often. The box still rested there, slightly ajar, the items inside shuffled from Charles's hands the day before. I hadn't moved it. Something in me wanted him to be the one to carry it away, to claim what was inside as part of himself again. I leaned forward and brushed my hand lightly over the lid, almost as if I could still feel the warmth of his fingers. Yesterday had been an opening, a small crack in the wall he had built around himself. But walls don't crumble in a day. I knew that. They take time, effort, and sometimes more reminders than a single box could hold. As the morning passed, I busied myself with chores, but my thoughts stayed tangled in the memory of Charles's face when he turned the pages of the album. It wasn't just guilt that I saw in his eyes. It was longing for a time when things were simpler, when love was shown not in money or possessions, but in shared moments. I thought of the boy who once climbed trees too high, who scraped his knees and came running for comfort. Somewhere inside the man who stood before me yesterday, that boy was still there. I had seen him flicker in his eyes. By afternoon I was sitting in the garden pruning Ellen's roses. Their thorns caught my gloves, and more than once I pricked my fingers, clipped away the dead petals. I thought about Charles's words on the phone, the ones he had whispered so quietly I nearly missed them. "I'll remember, Dad. I promise." Promises are fragile things. They can vanish as quickly as they are spoken, but they can also be the first step towards something stronger. I wanted to believe his, but belief was dangerous. It left you vulnerable. Still, as I looked at the roses blooming in the sunlight, I reminded myself that even fragile things can grow into something lasting if they are tended carefully enough. Around 3 o'clock I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. My heart leapt, though I tried to steady myself. I wiped the dirt from my gloves and rose, walking slowly toward the front door. When I opened it, Charles stood there again. This time his hands weren't empty. He held a small cake box, the kind you get from the bakery in town. His eyes met mine, hesitant but determined, and he said softly, "I know I'm late, but happy birthday, Dad." I felt the air catch in my chest. For a moment, words escaped me. I stepped aside and he entered the house, placing the box carefully on the kitchen table beside the package I had sent him. "It's not much," he continued, his voice uneven, "but I wanted to try. I wanted to make up for the other night." I looked at him then, not just at his face, but at his posture, his tone, his effort. He wasn't the careless man who had once dismissed me with cruel words. He was trying. And trying, however small, was more than I had seen from him in years. We sat together at the table, and he opened the bakery box to reveal a simple chocolate cake, the frosting uneven as though it had been rushed. He fumbled with the knife, cutting 2 crooked slices, and placed one in front of me. "I know it's late," he said again, "but I didn't want to leave things the way they were." I took a bite, the sweetness thick on my tongue, and for the first time in years the silence between us was not heavy. It was gentle, almost comforting. He looked at the watch again, still lying on the table where he had left it the day before, and his eyes softened. "I put it on last night," he admitted. "I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Mom's voice in my head. I remembered how she always said birthdays mattered, no matter how old someone got. I don't know why I forgot that. Maybe I didn't want to think about you getting older. Maybe it scared me." His honesty cut through me. I had never thought of it that way. Maybe his cruelty had been nothing more than fear wrapped in careless words. I placed my hand over his and said, "Getting older doesn't erase who I am, Charles. It doesn't erase what I've done for you, or what we've shared. It only makes those things matter more." He nodded, his eyes glistening. For the first time I saw in him not just regret, but understanding. And as we sat there, 2 slices of cake between us, I realized that the package had done its job. It had not only reminded him of what he had forgotten, it had forced him to face the truth. And now, in the quiet of that kitchen, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The sense that maybe, just maybe, we were beginning again. That night, after he left, I stood at the window and watched his car disappear down the street. I whispered softly to Ellen's picture on the mantel. He remembered. He finally remembered. And with that, I let myself smile. Not the faint, forced smile I had worn the night of my birthday, but a real one, born of hope and the fragile promise of something new. The day after Charles brought the cake, I woke with a sense of unease mixed with cautious hope. My body felt heavy with age, but my heart was restless. I lay in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling while the early morning light slowly filled the room. The words he had spoken the day before, I didn't want to leave things the way they were, lingered in my mind. They felt sincere, but sincerity could flicker out as quickly as it appeared. I had learned that lesson many times over the years. I wanted to believe him, to hold tightly to the warmth of that moment in the kitchen, but doubt whispered in the back of my mind. Was this change real? Or was it just guilt fading into routine again? When I finally rose and made my way into the kitchen, the remnants of the cake sat on the counter. Half of it remained in the box, the frosting smudged and uneven, the knife still resting beside it. I paused there for a long moment staring at it. It was imperfect, rushed, and small compared to the grand celebrations of the past, but it was something. More importantly, it was effort. After years of being met with indifference, even a small gesture felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. I cut myself another slice, savoring it not for its taste, but for what it represented, the possibility of something better. Later that morning, I stepped outside to tend to the roses. The sky was clear, the air brisk, and the neighborhood unusually quiet. As I pruned the bushes, my thoughts drifted back to when Charles was a boy. He used to help me out here, though help mostly meant clumsy snips and crushed petals. Ellen would laugh from the porch, her voice carrying across the yard like music. Charles would look up at me with wide eyes, always asking, "Did I do it right, Dad?" I always told him he did, even when he hadn't, because back then I knew encouragement mattered more than perfection. Those memories came rushing back now, and I wondered if somewhere deep down he remembered them too. Around noon, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel again. My heart jumped, though I forced myself to remain calm. I wiped my hands on a cloth and walked toward the door, and there he was, Charles, standing on the porch. This time he wasn't carrying a cake or a box. He was simply standing there, empty-handed, his expression uncertain. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I nodded and stepped aside. He walked into the house and stood in the middle of the living room, glancing around as though seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on the photographs along the walls, the one of Ellen at the piano, the family portrait from years ago, the fishing trip picture Alexa had drawn in crayon and which I'd pinned to the fridge. He seemed almost hesitant to sit down, so I gestured toward the couch. Once seated, he leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his elbows resting on his knees. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at the floor as though searching for the right words. Finally, he looked up at me and said, "Dad, I didn't just come here to say sorry again. I came because I need to tell you the truth about myself." I sat quietly, bracing myself. He took a deep breath and continued, "I've been selfish for years. I thought because you always stepped in to fix things, I didn't have to. I told myself it was your choice, that you wanted to help, that it wasn't my fault for leaning on you. But the truth is I took advantage of you. I let you carry the weight because it was easier for me, and when you needed the smallest thing from me just to be remembered on your birthday, I failed you." His voice cracked and he rubbed his hands over his face. "I don't know how to fix what I've done, but I know I don't want to keep being this way." I studied him carefully, searching for signs of pretense, but what I saw in his eyes was not the slick charm or forced confidence I had grown used to. It was rawness, vulnerability. For the first time in years, I saw my son without his armor. "Acknowledging it is the first step," I said quietly. "But words are only words, Charles. Change doesn't come from talking, it comes from living differently." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I know. I don't expect you to trust me yet. I just wanted you to hear it from me before I try to prove it." The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of the past. It was the kind that holds weight, the kind that comes when something important has finally been spoken aloud. He stayed for hours that afternoon, helping me in the yard without me asking. He trimmed the bushes carefully, slower than I did, but with attention I hadn't seen in him for years. At one point he paused, wiped the sweat from his brow, and said softly, "Mom would have liked seeing us like this." My throat tightened and I could only nod. When he left later that evening, he didn't just say goodbye. He placed his hand firmly on my shoulder, looked me in the eye, and said, "I'll be back tomorrow, not for apologies, just to be here." After he drove away, I stood in the garden, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I thought about Ellen's words engraved on that watch. Time is precious, spend it with one. Love. For the first time in years, I believed that Charles had finally begun to understand them. The package I had sent was no longer just a box filled with memories. It had become a turning point. As I walked back into the house, the weight on my chest felt lighter. I whispered to myself, maybe this time the change will last. Maybe this time he'll keep his promise. And as the shadows deepened in the room, I allowed myself to believe in the possibility of tomorrow. The days that followed felt unlike any I had known in years. For so long, the rhythm of my life had been quiet, steady, and heavy with loneliness. But now, each morning seemed to carry a new possibility. True to his word, Charles came back the very next day. He didn't bring a cake or flowers or any grand gesture. He simply arrived, walked into the house, and sat with me. At first, we filled the time with small things, cleaning the gutters, trimming the hedges, fixing a squeaky hinge on the back door. Tasks that once I had done alone, he now did beside me. It was clumsy at first, as if he wasn't sure how to just be in the same space without an excuse. But I could see him trying, and in that trying, something began to shift between us. I found myself watching him closely, not out of suspicion, but out of wonder. He would glance at Ellen's photograph on the mantel, and instead of looking away quickly, his eyes lingered there. Sometimes he would smile faintly, as if remembering something long forgotten. Other times his expression grew serious, almost regretful. Once, as we were eating lunch at the kitchen table, he pointed to the photograph of Ellen holding him as a baby. "She always believed in me," he whispered, almost as if to himself, "even when I didn't deserve it." I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. I knew then that the package had not only stirred his memory of me, it had brought his mother back into his heart as well. As the days turned into a week, I began to notice subtle changes in him. His tone softened when he spoke, not only to me, but to others. One afternoon, the phone rang while he was here, and it was his daughter calling. I listened as he answered, expecting the usual rushed tone he often used with her, but instead, his voice was warm, patient, even playful. "I'll come to your recital, I promise," he said. I wouldn't miss it for the world. When he hung up, he caught me watching and smiled sheepishly. "I'm trying, Dad," he said. And for the first time in a long while, I believed him. But I would be lying if I said the doubts disappeared completely. At night, when the house grew still again, I found myself lying awake, wondering if this change would last. I had seen him make promises before, and I had seen them crumble. I didn't want to harden my heart, but I also couldn't let myself be naive. It was Ellen's watch that reassured me most. Reading the engraving again and again. "Time is precious. Spend it with love." Those words reminded me that change, like time, could not be forced. It had to grow naturally, moment by moment, choice by choice. If Charles had truly taken those words into his heart, then maybe this time was different. One evening near the end of that week, we sat together on the porch as the sun dipped below the trees. The sky burned with streaks of red and gold, and the air carried the scent of cut grass. Charles sat quietly beside me, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the horizon. After a long silence, he spoke. "Dad, Do you know what scared me most when I opened that package? I turned to him. What? That you'd finally given up on me, he said, his voice low. When I saw the receipts, the photos, the watch, I thought maybe you were telling me goodbye, like you had carried me long enough, and now you were letting me see exactly how much I had wasted. He swallowed hard and rubbed the back of his neck. It terrified me, because I realized if you gave up on me, I'd have nothing left. The words struck me deeply. For years I had carried the weight of disappointment, but I had never once stopped being his father. And maybe that was what had shaken him most. That even in his neglect, even in his coldness, I had still held on. I wasn't giving up, I said quietly. I was reminding you. Because sometimes we all forget, and forgetting destroys more than remembering ever could. He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening in the fading light. I don't want to forget anymore. We sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. And in that silence, I felt something settle between us. Not perfection, not a clean slate, but something steadier. A new beginning. The package had started as a simple act of quiet defiance, a way to remind my son of the life we had shared, of the sacrifices that had been made, of the love that had always been present, even when it was ignored. But it had become something far greater. It had cracked open the walls around his heart. It had forced him to see, not just me, but himself, clearly for the first time in years. And in doing so, it had given us both something we thought we had lost: hope. That night after he left, I stood once again at Ellen's roses. The blooms were in full color, their petals glowing faintly in the twilight. I touched one gently, careful not to disturb its delicate shape. We did it, I whispered, as though Ellen could hear. He's finding his way back. I went inside, closed the door, and sat at the table with the empty cake box pushed aside. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt like a silence of loneliness. It felt like a silence of peace. It was something to think about. Family is complicated. We hurt each other, we disappoint each other, and sometimes we forget what really matters. But sometimes, one small act, a letter, a photograph, a watch, even a simple box, can shake someone awake. It can remind them of who they are and of who they're meant to be. So, let me ask you, what would you do if your son or daughter forgot your birthday, if they dismissed you as though you no longer mattered? Would you grow angry, or would you remind them, quietly but powerfully, of the love that can never truly be erased? If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your experiences, your reflections, or even just a simple line about what family means to you. And if you believe in the power of stories to remind us of the values we sometimes forget, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Because at the end of the day, birthdays aren't about age. They're about respect, love, and the time we still have with the people who matter most. And if my son could learn that lesson from a single package, maybe someone you love can too. Thank you for listening, and remember, time is precious. Spend it with love.